Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Classic Guitar Rock channel. It's been a while since I've put anything up. Hope you had a great Christmas. Hope you had a great New Year's. You know, I hadn't listened to this album for quite a while, and last night I just felt like listening to it, and I was so inspired that I wanted to just make this quick video about what I think is perhaps Black Sabbath's most underrated, under the radar album. It's just a really good album. And I'm talking about 1987's The Eternal Idol album. That's not an album that gets a lot of press. The whole Tony Martin era gets very little press, which is unfortunate. Tony Martin is excellent. He's awesome. Tony Martin's problem was that he followed Ozzy Osbourne and Ronnie Dio. And Black Sabbath fans, I mean, there are Ozzy folks in the Ozzy camp that don't like Dio, and folks in the Dio camp that don't like Ozzy. And I think what you have to do with Black Sabbath, and I say the same thing about Van Halen, you have to treat the Ozzy era Sabbath and the Dio era Sabbath as two different bands. Okay? And if you do that, you won't have any problems. You don't have to compare the two. They're just two great bands. Similar with Van Halen. You don't have to compare Dave to Sam. Okay? Two great bands, two great eras. There's great stuff from both eras. You can say the same thing about AC/DC. You know, why argue and fight about whether you like Brian or Bon better? Just treat them as two different bands. Okay? So, Tony Martin came in after two phenomenal, legendary frontmen. Had Tony Martin been in any other band in the 80s, he would probably be viewed as one of the great lead singers of the time, because the dude is really good. Tony Martin, a great singer, great vocalist. And if you're looking at the change from Ozzy to Dio, pretty significant. It was a major change in the sound of Black Sabbath. Dio, a much different singer than Ozzy, technically a much better singer than Ozzy, but Ozzy had his own distinct sound that no one else sounded like Ozzy, and to many folks, that is the sound of Black Sabbath. So Dio comes along, major change from the legacy Black Sabbath with Ozzy, but still very cool, and a lot of people really dug it. Well, Tony Martin, in my mind, is more of a continuation of the Dio era Sabbath than the Ozzy era Sabbath. I could totally see Dio singing many of the songs that you hear on The Eternal Idol and Headless Cross and other albums that have Tony Martin on them. But unfortunately for Tony, you know, he never really got a lot of recognition or appreciation, simply because he was following, you know, Ozzy and Dio, which is a shame, because the guy is quality, does a great job on this album. Ian Gillan, Born Again. Ian Gillan, great singer. I love him in Deep Purple. I'm not a fan of the Born Again album. Ian Gillan was not a good fit for Sabbath. Some people like that album. Eternal Idol kicks the crap out of Born Again, to me. Okay, I think Tony Martin sounds better than Ian Gillan. The production is way better. But for whatever reason, this album just does not get the appreciation that it should. And let's go back even before the Eternal Idol album to the Seventh Star album. So Seventh Star was... it began its life as a Tony Iommi solo project. It was going to be a Tony Iommi album. Pressure from the label, pressure from Don Arden. Basically, they twisted Tony's arm and made him call it Black Sabbath, right? And the initial releases, it was Black Sabbath featuring Tony Iommi. And then I think in later versions, it just might be called Black Sabbath. But the version that I have says, you know, Black Sabbath featuring Tony Iommi. Tony Iommi is the only original person on the album. They brought in Glenn Hughes. Check out my podcast episode on Glenn Hughes, by the way. Seventh Star, again, you have to separate. A lot of the diehard Sabbath fans are not wild about Sabbath or Seventh Star because it does not sound like a Black Sabbath album. It's a good album. Glenn Hughes is awesome. There's some great songs on it. But no, it doesn't really sound like a Sabbath album, but it wasn't meant to be a Sabbath album. It was only at the last minute that the label made Tony call it a Sabbath album. Well, why do I bring that up? Well, that whole era of the band, Geezer's not involved. Bev Bevan was on drums. Dave Spitz was playing bass. Jeff Nichols, longtime kind of shadow member of Black Sabbath. He'd been with the group since Ozzy days playing keyboards. He was involved in the project. So they do the Seventh Star. They even do a tour, try to do a tour with Glenn Hughes. Glenn Hughes, as much as I love Glenn Hughes today, he was at the height of his raging drug addiction in the 80s. And guys, it was so bad. Remember Hughes Thrall? Remember that great Hughes Thrall album from the early 80s? Pat Thrall and Glenn Hughes. Another great album. Those guys were so whacked out on drugs, they couldn't do a tour, right? They tried to, but they couldn't. Well, mid-80s, Glenn Hughes is the lead singer of Sabbath now. They try and tour. Same thing, okay? Glenn Hughes could not hold it down because he was so messed up. The good news is he's been sober for several years now, clean and sober for a long time. He's doing great. Been in several bands since then. I love Glenn Hughes. But at that time, he was in bad shape. So they bring in another guy named Ray Gillen, who finishes that tour. And Ray Gillen was on deck when it came time to make the Eternal Idol album. And they also bring in, I believe they started out with Dave Spitz on bass for Eternal Idol. So they got Iommi, they got Dave Spitz at the beginning. I think Jeff Nichols is involved. I believe from the beginning, Eric Singer was on drums. Eric Singer has played he's in Kiss now. He's been in Kiss for the last 20 years. But Eric Singer has played with just about everyone. I mean, he's one of the most prolific. Well, Glenn Hughes was the same way. Played with so many different people. He's a great drummer. Eric Singer was involved. Well, at some point, and they've got, and Ray Gillen. He had just finished the tour filling in for Glenn Hughes, and so now he's on board for the next album, which would be Eternal Idol. They wind up bringing in Bob Daisley. Now, Bob Daisley, obviously, connection with Ozzy. Bob Daisley basically wrote all of Ozzy's material. He was playing with Gary Moore at the time, but Sabbath brought him in to help to play bass and to actually help with lyrics, even though the record cover, the album cover doesn't really credit Daisley with lyrics, but he actually was there to help write lyrics. Began working with Ray Gillen. At some point in the process, there were financial issues, right? Gillen wasn't getting paid. Dave Spitz wasn't getting paid. Though I'm not sure on the timeline because Spitz left first because Bob Daisley came in, because Bob Daisley did work with Ray Gillen for a while. But at some point, Gillen left, and it came down to money. It sounds like he wasn't getting paid or something was going on. He leaves. Daisley's in and has been in. Eric Singer's on drums. Jeff Nichols is playing keys. Well, they bring in Tony Martin. So a lot of these songs were originally written with Ray Gillen. Tony did not help with any of the lyrics. He came in, his job was to come in and sing. So he came in fairly late in the process and sang on these songs that began with Ray Gillen. In fact, you can go on YouTube and find versions of many of these songs with Ray Gillen singing. Ray Gillen's a whole other story. He died in the early 90s. Phenomenal talent. He was a member of Badlands with Jakey Lee and Eric Singer later on. And if you can find those Badlands albums, they're great. They're awesome. His whole story is kind of sad. Died at a very young age of AIDS. But that's a whole nother story. Tony Martin comes in, sings the songs that were originally written with or for Ray Gillen, does a phenomenal job. Can't say enough about how great a job Tony Martin does on this album. And he wound up being in Sabbath 2 different stints. He's the second longest singer. Only Ozzy was in Sabbath longer than Tony Martin. Most people don't realize that. And Tony Martin doesn't really get the credit he deserves because he did great work in Sabbath. And, you know, through all the years, there would be times that, you know, Dio left, he came back, he did Dehumanizer, he did the whole heaven and hell thing later. You know, Ozzy came back a few different times. So all of this is going on. People always think of Sabbath as Ozzy or Ronnie. They forget about Tony Martin. And Tony Martin produced some great albums with Sabbath. For my money, the Eternal Idol album is the best of the Tony Martin albums, but there are other great albums featuring Tony, and I would recommend that you check those out. But the thing that strikes me about Eternal Idol, more so than Seventh Star, is you get the Sabbath riffs on Eternal Idol. There are several songs that it just sounds like a Sabbath song, right? Not so much on the Seventh Star album, even though I love Seventh Star, but it sounds even less Sabbathy, right? But on the Eternal Idol, there's not a bad song on the album. The weakest song on the album is the final song, which is also the title track, the Eternal Idol, and that's my least favorite. It's not a bad song. It's my least favorite. It seems the most contrived. If you were gonna hire a band and say, "Hey, I want you play a riff that sounds like a Sabbath riff," okay? It sounds like kind of a contrived Tony Iommi riff, which is funny for me to say because Tony Iommi wrote it, but it almost sounds like if you're doing a parody of a Sabbath riff, it would kind of sound like the Eternal Idol riff. Again, not a bad song, and the vocals are great. You know, it's an okay riff, but it's not as memorable as other riffs on the album. Here's another thing that jumps out at me when I listen to this album. There are several songs that, this is going to sound funny when I say this, there are several songs on the album that are too fast for Sabbath. It doesn't mean I don't like them, but when I say too fast for Sabbath, I mean they don't sound like the stereotypical Sabbath. What's a Tony Iommi riff usually, right? They're kind of sludgy and mid-tempo and just super heavy, and there's plenty of those. But there are like 3 songs on this album that are really upbeat, really fast. And in fact, some of them, when I first hear just the opening riff, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to like this. But then without fail, you know, the cool, you know, drum riff comes in right before the vocal starts. The vocals start, and bam, there's a vocal hook that grabs you, and it turns into a really cool song, right? That happens 3 or 4 times on this album. If you have not listened to the Eternal Idol, you got to listen to it. You can stream it. it's interesting. If you go on Spotify, you can stream Eternal Idol, but there are other Tony Martin Sabbath albums that aren't on Spotify for whatever reason. Now, Sabbath just announced that they are going to be re-releasing the Tony Martin era. So that will probably change soon, and you can check out all the Tony Martin releases with Sabbath. I'm hoping that's the case, because Tony Martin's a tremendous talent. And like I said earlier, had he been in another band, not following Ozzy, not following Ronnie, he literally would probably be viewed as one of the great singers of the 80s, because the guy is really good, really talented guy. He can pull off the Dio stuff, and yet he's got kind of a more accessible, guys, this is 87 we're talking about when this came out, which is a good thing. So there was a lot of good rock in 86, 87, 80, the late 80s, right? And Tony Martin is as good as anyone from that era. So it's kind of a shame that he doesn't get the attention that a lot of singers of that era did, because he's better than most of them, right? And this Eternal Idol album is really good. So do yourself a favor. If you have not listened to the album, just go stream it. If you can find it, buy it. But it's a great album. And I love Bob Daisley. So Bob Daisley, and of course it's Tony Iommi, man, the riff meister. What's not to like? Check it out, Black Sabbath's Eternal Idol from 1987. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. If you haven't followed or subscribed to the podcast, please take a minute and do that. And we will see you next time right here on the Classic Guitar Rock channel.